Thank you, Brother Whitten. I'd like, first of all, to defend myself because I've been falsely accused. It's true that I live in Austin, but I have a son who's a full-time employee of Texas A&M. And therefore, I'm persecuted constantly in Austin because of that. My wife, on the back of her automobile, has two bumper stickers. One says, "I'm an Aggie's mom." The other says, "I believe in Jackie." Cheryl, of course. And the week after those bumper stickers were placed, someone there in the congregation said, "We know why you have those bumper stickers. That's so you can park in the handicapped parking places." So we put up with that kind of thing all along. But I at least wanted to make it clear that I do live in Austin and I'm surrounded by Longhorns, but we have a son who works full-time for Texas A&M. So when we see the games, we see them privately. We don't want anyone to know who we're rooting for, you know. The job's at stake on one hand and then loyalty toward our son on the other. We appreciate the invitation given to us that we might come and be with you and speak on this, one of the premier lectureships of our schools of preaching. We've long since admired from afar, before we moved to this state, Brown Trail and its work. It's a great pleasure thus that we can participate, and we appreciate the theme. We're so glad that this material is placed in book form. It will be a fortifying thing in the libraries of members of the church and gospel preachers and in church libraries. We're so glad that thus we could have a part. I regret that I could not be here at the scheduled time. I understand Brother Andrew Connolly and perhaps others worked in the shifting of things. I know there's some brethren who do not appreciate the terminology providentially hindered. But I think I was providentially hindered. I can't think of anything more providential than when the Lord decides He'll transfer the North Pole to Austin, Texas. And therefore, I chalk it all up to providence. I just could not get here. And I'm glad, though, that we were able to see a change in the weather and that thus we could be here. I am sorry that I could not be here on Monday to speak on the works of the flesh. 4/5 of the lectureship is gone, and now I'm to speak on the works of the flesh, and all my sins have been dealt with, I feel. And I don't know whether there's anything left. I may not be covering anything other than just repeating something that's already been said. I really think that Brother Frank Dunn, my fellow Austinite, he lives on an island on one side of town. I live on an island on the other side of town. We live in a sea of liberalism. But my fellow islander, Brother Frank Dunn, I think, has given a pretty good introduction. By way of contrast, then, as we notice the works of the flesh laid over against that godly manner of life that he has spoken of in such a fine way. Let's begin by pointing out that those who know their New Testaments recognize that the Apostle Paul to the Galatians was dealing with the problem of Judaizing teachers and their influence among the saints of God. In fact, early on in chapter 1 and verse number 6 beginning, Paul had pointed out his great shock that some in the Galatian congregation so quickly were allowing themselves to be removed from him who called them into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. They, of course, according to Paul's statement in 2 Thessalonians 2 and 14, they had been called by the gospel. They had answered that call that's in the gospel by rendering obedience to the Lord's will. Thus, the gospel of Jesus Christ and the grace extended to man. These Galatians had heard and they believed it and they responded obediently to it. And then they were in grace and in the family of God, in the fellowship with God. Now Paul says that because you're giving heed to these false teachers, these evil influences, thus you're allowing yourselves to be removed. That which had guided them in the gospel that they'd heard, in the gospel that they'd believed, that which they obeyed, happened to be that which was Spirit written. In 2 Peter 1 and verse number 21, in describing the process of inspiration, the apostle said, "Holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit." We all in our obedience then have rendered obedience to the message of the Spirit. It's not then surprising when we think of those terms that the Apostle Paul to the Galatians very often would refer to the Spirit. He did so in Galatians 3:2 when he pointed out that by the hearing of faith, these men had thus received the Spirit. In verse number 5, he told them that the Spirit had been ministered unto them. Down in verse number 14, he mentioned the fact that they had received the promise of the Spirit through faith. In chapter number 5 and in verse number 5, he pointed out that they indeed were to wait through the Spirit under the realization of all that God has in store for the faithful. In that chapter, in verses 16 and 18 and 25, he described faithful and godly Christian living as living in the Spirit, being led of the Spirit, walking in the Spirit. Not surprising then that the Apostle Paul, who had preached the Spirit's gospel, had preached the word that the Spirit had given to man through inspired means, not surprising when he saw apostasy underway. Not surprising when he saw the saints of God moving away from faithfulness, that he would say so much about the Spirit of God because they were moving to something else. Not surprising also that in chapter number 5, verses 22 and 23, that the Apostle Paul, still in speaking of the Spirit and of that message from the Spirit, then describes the fruit of the Spirit to be manifest in the lives of those who belong to God. That holy living that Brother Dunn spoke of, he thus characterizes it as the fruit of the Spirit. When he talks about love and joy and peace and long-suffering and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and meekness and self-control. And we'll not have time to go into those in any detail, but some material is in the lectureship book regarding that. But suffices to let us know that that's the kind of attitude, disposition, character, mode of life, manner of conduct that God says should be in those who belong to Him. Over against that is the work of the devil, the works of the flesh. And thus we have that contrast, and thus I said that type of holy life that Brother Dunn spoke of stands in contrast to my assigned topic, and that is the works of the flesh. And we'll be able to see those anytime we read, especially the epistle to the Galatians. We're able to see those just in observing the lives of those who are members of the church. Sad to say, we can see the works of the flesh in some lives of members of the body of Christ. I'm so thankful that we can also see the fruit of the Spirit in examining those lives. Interestingly, down near the end of Galatians 5, after Paul has listed the fruit of the Spirit, in verse 23 he makes the point, against such there is no law. One who abides by the will of God applies that word to his life and his life to that word, he will bear the fruit of the Spirit. He will be, using Paul's terms, living in the Spirit, walking in the Spirit, being led of the Spirit. These things will be manifest in his life, and he will not be contrary to the law of God. More than that, he'll live in keeping with civil law that's right and proper over him. He will live concerning the law of decency and neighborliness regarding those around him. He will be at peace with those in the congregations, those in the family of God, because he, in abiding by the teaching of the gospel of Christ, he, in showing these fruits in his life, he indeed will not be a lawbreaker. But it's in contrast with that the Apostle Paul had earlier spoken of the works of the flesh. And that's the part that we're now going to emphasize, and by request, some special emphasis on the latter thing that's mentioned in that list, though there is no specific point, and simply such like. I really believe that some who wear the name of Christ are not going to be lost because they have broken the law of God with respect to the adultery or fornication or some of the other things specifically mentioned, but it's some of those such like things that are going to get them. And that's a pretty wide category. And by the assignment, I was especially asked, after listing the works of the flesh, to notice the such like category. In our obedience to the will of God, we've already said that we're obeying the message that God's Spirit gave. We are then to be dedicated to the Lord, and our purpose in obeying the gospel is in declaration that we're going to live faithful to Him. There must first of all be the approach to God and God's will with a readiness of mind. Setting the affections, Paul termed it in Colossians 3, verses 1 through 3. It is called a receiving of the word with readiness of mind in Acts 17 and verse number 11. It is called the giving of the word a good reception out of a good and honest heart in Luke 8 and verse number 15. In Acts 2 and verse number 41, it's said to be a glad reception of the word. In Romans 12 and verse number 2, it is said to be a nonconformity to the world, but then that we're to prove that which is the good and perfect will of God. Verse number 1 says, rendering unto him that which our reasonable or spiritual service. Maybe it's best said by Paul in Romans 8 and verse number 6, for to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Now, in contrast to that spiritual life, in contrast to that living by the Spirit, walking in the Spirit, being led of the Spirit, in contrast to that spiritual mind, in contrast to the life that exemplifies, bears out, demonstrates the fruit of the Spirit, Paul in Galatians 5, verses 19 through 21, describes then the works of the flesh. We cannot be exhaustive in looking at some of these, but at least we will look at them and give some definition. I think probably all of us thus will have no trouble with them at any time. In looking at it in the overall, there are some categories of things mentioned there called works of the flesh. For example, the Apostle Paul deals with sexual sins, misconduct regarding one's abuse in that area. The Apostle Paul deals with some sins that are of excess and immoderation. He deals with some sins of character and disposition. He deals with some sins of worship and religious practice. He deals with some sins having to do with the lack of control that one would thus have as characteristic of his life. And he deals with a broader category without any specific things being mentioned that he simply calls the such-like area. And we'll be talking about that in a moment. Let's look at some of these works of the flesh. He mentions first of all, the word fornication. That happens to be illicit sexual intercourse. It is the general term describing that behavior, more general than a specific word, adultery, which describes the same type sin, but deals with those who have already entered into a marriage contract or sin involving one who is involved in marriage. This is the more general term, but referring to the same sin. All sins of sexual misbehavior and perversion. This is the word fornication. It's one of the avenues that the Apostle Paul mentioned that led Israel to her downfall, 1 Corinthians 10 and 8. It is so fraught with danger, with difficulty, with the promise of damnation and loss of the soul, that the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 and 18 said, flee from fornication. And we live in a day and time when fornication is glamorized, when fornication is recommended, when it's presented in a desirable light before young and old. All the communication media presents fornication and then perversions regarding sex. It's on the screens, it's in the books, it's in the magazines. Young people and old people are exposed to that. We're wallowing in that. And it's one of those things in verse 21 that the Apostle Paul gives the guarantee that those who practice such things will not go to heaven. More than that, we live in a time, when you talk about the works of the flesh, we live in a time when people are substituting God's ordained marriage institution for the live-in arrangement. The sad thing about it, in all of these tabloids that people buy and our young people are exposed to, and then when they hear these show business and entertainment personalities on the talk shows speak about their live-in relationship, and always in a favorable light as they present it, their great love that they just moved in together. They did not need benefit of marriage license. They didn't need any words said before a minister or a civil servant, and their great love, and our people are hearing that, and they're saying love and they mean lust. And they're misusing The good Bible word love. Not it's recommended, but it's a Bible word that's used over and over again, and they're saying love, and our young people are feeding on that kind of thing. More than that, we've even got some of our secular schools are encouraging that kind of thing on their campuses. It doesn't make any difference how widespread it becomes. It doesn't make any difference how much it becomes the accepted lifestyle. If finally everybody on earth forsakes God's marriage law and they practice adultery and fornication, the Apostle Paul still says they will not go to heaven. It's interesting that he begins that list of the works of the flesh with this one, fornication. But it's worse when you think of the family of God, because now you're hearing some so abuse God's marriage law that their teaching is in effect designed to bring the adulterers and the fornicators into the family of God. Isn't it a pitiful thing that what the Apostle Paul says will send one to torment? We've actually got some people who stand in our pulpits who so misuse what God teaches concerning the marriage law, what God says concerning adultery and how it's condemned and what God says about it. They will so misuse it that which will send a person to torment is that which is actually recommended and the doors swung wide to invite them in. Fornication, one of the works of the flesh. The next word that's mentioned is uncleanness. That has to do simply with impurity, but especially impurity of a sort that partakes of lewd and ungodly and lustful, licentious type of behavior. Lewdness that indeed partakes of depravity and a dissolute manner of life. Over and over again in the New Testament, the sins of the Gentiles who did not know of God, and once having known God, didn't care to retain a knowledge of God in their minds, and therefore in marriage, and in their dealing with one another, and all of their filth, and all of their perversion, uncleanness is the word that is so often used to describe it, but it is a general term, simply referring to impurity, and especially the marks of a dissolute and degenerate kind of life. Such could not be characteristic of the child of God. That's why Paul says such will send you to torment. The next word is lasciviousness. This has to do with uncleanliness, but in the sense of giving in to lust. That is, unbridled lust, wantonness, and we'll illustrate this a little bit later with one of those such-like sins, but widely characteristic of Gentile behavior. And it's the idea that one gives in and he follows his lust. Just as an animal would follow his desire, so people who propose to be God's children, and that's the setting, Paul is warning the saints of God against the works of the flesh, then they follow that which is really to give in to lust. And they satisfy their desires, oftentimes in a lewd and vulgar manner, lasciviousness. And that cannot be characteristic of the child of God. He does not live by lust, he lives by law. It doesn't make any difference about some of the grace-only advocates. I find out about God's grace because God's law tells me about that. And therefore, those in Jesus Christ, they do not live by lust. They live by law, loving submissiveness to the law of God. They cannot have lasciviousness as characteristic of their life. The next thing that's mentioned is idolatry, simply the worship of other gods. It is false worship. Very commonly practiced, the downfall of Israel again, commonly practiced among the Gentile world, commonly practiced in its literal form, even throughout the world today, but more dangerous and frightful concerning the child of God, is not the possibility that you and I will ever build us a statue of a bird or beast or a combination and fall down before it, but that we will elevate in heart and mind and life something before Almighty God, and that by New Testament definition renders us also idolaters. In Colossians 3 and verse number 5, when Paul described some things that the child of God, if he belongs to God, he must mortify. Now see, that's the King James word. I grew up under the King James translation. I'll even defend it. But more than that, I used to hear older people than myself, I was mortified. We get our word mortician there. You can see the idea of death. Therefore, put to death. Paul said, put to death these things that indeed you could allow to be in the members of your body. The last one of the list was covetousness, which is idolatry. There's a work of the flesh. Now, you just find that church member and he really loves some person, or he loves something, or he loves his job, or he loves his hobby, or he loves whatever it is. And that comes before Almighty God, you can put him down as an idolater. Now, he'd argue with the Lord on that, wouldn't he? He may have occasion to in the day of judgment. When the Lord turns him away because you practice the works of the flesh, you are an idolater. But notice what Paul says, covetousness, that is idolatry. The next one listed in the works of the flesh is sorcery. Interestingly, the background of this word, because it gives us, through the passing of from the root, it gives us the word pharmacy, where the chemicals are mixed together. Do us good is the design, but its beginning was bad. It had to do in its ancientness, it had to do with the use of potents, the use of drugs in idolatrous, ritualistic worship, where there was the idea of the wizardry, the magic, the enchantments, the supposed contact with the supernatural, the communication with departed spirits or those in the spirits world and all of that. That's the background of sorcery. Simon, you remember in Acts chapter 8, Simon the sorcerer bewitched the people through the practice of his particular tools of trade. For us, it would simply be false religion. It would be error, and notice the connection, especially that error that would claim modern day revelation, some communication given from outside the Scriptures, or communication that one would have with God that the Word of God does not substantiate. It would have to do with some of these false teachers so widely exposed to us through the communications media who've got messages from God and they got special contact with God and communications with departed spirits or communications with saints of old and that kind of thing. That's the idea of sorcery, especially a problem back in the days of the New Testament, but in terms of analogy, still existing today, and a work of the flesh. Notice there the idea of worship and false religious practices were condemned. The next category is a fairly long one. And I think there the apostle is telling us something when he gave more space and enumerated more things that have to do with our disposition, our character, our motivation, how thus we would deal with one another, how the body of Jesus Christ would be affected, and the division, the turmoil, and the strife that thus would come from it. About 7 things mentioned in this category. And no doubt by definition some of them overlap, but we'll just hurriedly notice some of those. He begins first of all with enmities. There he describes the feeling of ill will, the feeling of hatred, as it were, an antagonistic or a feeling of hostility that could arise if the child of God allowed that to arise within him toward others. Enmities, the kind of feelings that enemies would have toward one another, but that which a child of God cannot have. Matthew 5:44, the child of God is told to love even his enemies. Therefore, he cannot have a feeling of enmity between himself and someone else. Notice now we're talking about the sins of disposition, the sins of character, the sins that gets within man's own heart and mind, and that's an area. Notice the next one, strifes. And that by definition simply means an attitude or behavior denoting then the idea of contention and wrangling, an uncalled for feeling of rivalry and competition. You think of the church at Corinth in this regard? You think of the Apostle Paul describing their party spirit and describing their carnality in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, the early verses, and the fact that they were non-spiritual. He could not even speak to them as unspiritual people, 1 Corinthians 3:1, because of that strife that they had going on. The next one is jealousies. Jealousies. That is simply the feeling wherein one is disturbed and one is discontent, one is upset, one is unhappy over the good fortune or the progress or goods or place or any good that someone else has. And he's unhappy because that's so. That does not fit the Lord's teaching that we're to rejoice with those that rejoice. that we're to look upon the things of others, not with a covetous or jealous spirit, but with a feeling of joy that he has that good, joy that he has that prosperity, if he uses it properly, joy that things are well with him. Notice that Paul again condemned the Corinthian congregation, you're carnal, because of the jealousy there in your midst. I'll have to hurry to get to the such likes now. But the next one that he mentions is the matter of, after the jealousy, is the matter of wrath. Now that's anger gone to seed. It is anger not controlled at all. It's the disposition where one loses control, may be given to outburst, has a pugnacious attitude. He talks about the wraths. You know, the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. And it is a work of the flesh because it is from Satan. You know, the child of God, as some statement of the child of God, is that he is a controlled being. And wrath does not fit that. The next is factions. That simply means a pulling apart, a making of a difference. That is factionalism in the church, the dividing. Something similar that we'll now include with it a little bit later is parties, the party spirit. The tendency to pull oneself away, the tendency to form in a little cluster over here, uncalled for. I know there are times when there must be the faithful saints of God indeed separating themselves from an ungodly element. That's not what's being talked of. That's talked about the family of God being torn, the family of God uncalled for, being divided by a party spirit, by factionalism. Think again of Paul's approach to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. The party spirit, the divisive spirit. Well, the apostle here lists divisions, literally to effect an overthrow, as in the military, as in warfare, the taking of a city. It's the fruit of the party spirit. It's the fruit of the dissension. It's the fruit of the strife that finally God's law is overthrown. God's good order is overthrown. God's rules are trampled underfoot, and men simply go to the fullest limit. And they do their own pleasure in that regard. He describes next the matter of envyings. That goes further than jealousy, because it is jealousy, but it is envy over someone's good that then you feed on that to finally you wish him ill. You wish he didn't have it. Not only were you jealous that he does have it, you wish he didn't have it. In other words, you depreciate his character and you depreciate him because of good that he has. The last two mention specifically the matter of drunkenness. I don't believe a man is a drunkard when he is drunk. If that is characteristic of his life, I think he's a drunkard when he's sober. If he hadn't repented of it, if he hadn't quit that manner of life, he has the disposition that he's allowed that to get a hold on him, and he's going to proceed on that. It's one who's intoxicated, one who's under the influence, one who's under the control, one who loves it. The matter of drunkenness. Then he talks, of course, then finally about revelings. That literally has to do with merrymaking and carousing, oftentimes associated with loud and boisterous parties carried on late at night, oftentimes accompanied with music that fits in well with any numbers of the other lusts of the flesh. And it does not have to do with a congregational get-together. It does not have to do with the saints of God or our young people getting together with proper behavior. It does have to do with some of the lewd and vulgar music. It does have to do with the drinking, the drugs, and everything else that's associated with some of the so-called merrymaking that goes on. Those are the things listed specifically. And then Paul adds this, and such like. We want to deal with some of the such like things. When the Apostle Paul said that he was letting us know, I haven't exhausted the list. He's saying, I'm sure that you human beings, with Satan's help, you can think of some, and you can engage in some that I haven't bothered to list. And I have 2 or 3 categories that I'm going to hurriedly now, in the next 10 minutes, cover in this regard. And let's begin with drink and drug abuse. Now, I won't say drug abuse, simply because I know that there are those that, because of health reasons, must indeed take some medication. I have to carry a little nitroglycerin bottle with me all the time, and there are 2 heart tablets that I always must have handy for use sometimes during the day. I don't think that is drug abuse, but liquor itself is a drug. And no child of God, because he belongs to God and because this body is to be that which is used by the Spirit of God, no child of God should allow himself thus to be addicted to medication unless it is to correct some situation. I think indeed there needs to be some concern on the part of some of God's children who gobble the pills when they don't need to. But notice the matter of drink. That is a drug. It's the nation's #1 drug problem. And that which the Lord said is forbidden to kings. That which the Lord said, you shall not give to your neighbor. That which the Lord said in Proverbs 21 is a mocker, and one is deceived thereby if he participates in it. And then especially Proverbs 23:29 to the end of the chapter, where Solomon goes to some length to describe the woe, the contentions, the wounds, the redness of eyes, the imbalance, the searching eye and mind and heart that will lead to adultery and fornication. We may have mentioned the imbalance, the sickness, the wounds, the being stricken and all of that. And then he ends with the addictive element of it. When I awake, I will seek it yet again. That is not in keeping with Christian character, not for a child of God to take one drink of it. I believe frankly, and I know there are some members of the church that feel different, and if you feel different, don't tell me because I won't think right of you if that's so. I know there are some members of the church will speak in justification of social drinking, but I believe in the light of the type of character that God wants us to be, that one cannot participate in drink at all. One drink makes one drink drunk. And it's the most ironic and ridiculous thing in the world for one who's a child of God, who by virtue of being a child of God is saying, I'm stepping apart from the world, I'm devoted to the Lord's service, His Spirit is to live within me, I am guided by His Word, I'm to be an example to lost men, and then speak in favor of taking a social drink. It is a work of the flesh. And any number of times to young people I've recommended, why don't you girls abide by the old rule when I heard that I heard when I was a boy, lips that touch wine will never touch mine. And why don't you try to live to be 65 and 70 years of age and be able to say, I have never had one drink? And why don't we teach our young people to be such sterling characters in the Lord's service that there is no appeal for them to experiment with drugs or drink? They're not interested because they know of it and they see the fruits of it. They're not interested in wanting to know what it tastes like, wanting to know what it feels like. The fact that it is wrong is enough to say, I abstain. Homosexuality and incest, both of them forbidden in the Old Testament. Some of these things punishable even by death. And God thus lets us know what He thinks of that. But homosexuality, the best thing in the New Testament that condemns it is that awful picture, a sickening picture in Romans chapter 1. When Paul describes those who did not desire to have a knowledge of God and therefore leaving a knowledge of God, they went into both idolatry and then took those natural feelings that God said that we could give way to and exercise the product of them in marriage and in marriage only, and man with woman in marriage. And Paul describes that ugly picture in Romans 1:24 through 27, when he describes men turning with men and women going to women and doing that unnatural, unseemly, giving way to vile affections. And notice in that context, 3 times God said, I gave them up. And yet the homosexual lobby is one of the strongest that is working constantly in all of our state capitals and in our nation's capital to remove all moral and religious stigma away from it. The saints of God had better be fighting it. We're wallowing in that kind of thing. We become the laughing stock of some parts of the world that years ago we said, oh, how liberal they are in terms of morals, and now they're laughing at us because of homosexuality, a work of the flesh, with incest or any other kind of perversion, a work of the flesh. How about the matter of dancing and promiscuous behavior? Dancing fits exactly by the definition given us of lasciviousness. Indecent bodily movements, unchaste, improper handling between males and females. The ridiculous thing that some members of the church allow their youngsters to engage in such, and oftentimes are pushed to engage in such because that's the social thing. And the ridiculous thing is that if that young man and that young woman were doing on the porch what is done in the dance, but without music, the father would break it up. But then you can turn on vulgar music, which, have you listened to the lyrics? That's lascivious itself, a lot of that music. And even country music, which for a number of years was looked upon, when everything else got dirty, it was looked upon as being fairly decent. Now it's as dirty as can be. One can be lascivious in dress. Lasciviousness is seen in the dance. One can be lascivious in his speech. One can be lascivious in a manner of life. It fits dancing exactly. It fits the improper conduct, the improper touching and handling of one another as in promiscuous behavior or petting. It fits it exactly. Let's not confine lasciviousness to dancing. Anything that participates of those descriptions is lasciviousness. Pornography, we're wallowing in it. We're wallowing in it. It is big business in our country, and big business often associated indeed with organized crime. We'll not have to say much about it. When the Apostle Paul says that we're to bring, yea, every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, 2 Corinthians 10 and verse number 5, it lets the child of God know that he must think right things. Remember the great list in Philippians chapter 4 and verse number 8, virtuous things, good things, right things, pure things. Think on these things. That rules out pornography. The matter of smoking. The child of God, after more than 20 years of the Surgeon General announcing the scientific and proper findings concerning tobacco, that some of God's children still burn incense to the devil. And I have noted in the book in Oklahoma, just this past year or so, a 19-year-old, I believe it was, a teenager, who lost his life as a result of cancer that finally went to his brain, and the doctor said it was because of the smokeless tobacco that he was using. There's nothing as unsightly as to see some of our young men going around with that telltale circle on the back pocket of their jeans, indicating that they've got the Skoal or the Kodiak or what have you. They've got it there. That's unbecoming the child of God. When are we going to be smart enough to heed the warnings and to know what's said about the body, that thus we're going to abide by what the Lord said? There are other things that could be said. There are many such like categories. I trust that we've at least opened the door. There's more material in the book. Let's sum it up by saying this. The child of God is to live by God's law. God's law is to live within him. He is to be a controlled being, not only his actions, but yea, his very thoughts brought captive to the obedience of Christ. Fleshly lust, the Apostle Peter says, war against the soul. 1 Peter 2 and verse number 11. The same apostle said in 1 Peter 4 and verse number 2, that we as God's children cannot live the rest of our lives from the time of our obedience. We cannot live the rest of our lives to the lust of men, but to the will of God.